The water was my only church. Every afternoon, just before 3, I'd lower myself into the cool blue embrace of my backyard pool. The pain in my lower back, a constant grinding reminder of a collapsed tunnel, and a career I'd left buried under tons of rock, would finally quiet down. For an hour, I wasn't a 50-something hydrogeologist with a bad back and a silent house. I was just a man floating, weightless. That peace is a hard thing to put a price on. But, as I'd soon find out, my homeowners association had a number in mind. It started with the scrape of the gate latch, a sound that didn't belong. I turned my head, treading water, and saw 2 figures silhouetted against the bright Texas sun. The first was Carol, our homeowners association president, a woman built like a bulldog in a floral print dress. The second was a man with a smile that was too wide and too white for his face. We'll call him Smiley. He had that slick, predatory look of a contractor who charges by the hour and works by the minute. This kind of encounter, it never just happens by accident. If you've been watching Karenology for a while, you know the script. It's never a friendly chat, it's an ambush. Carol didn't bother with hellos. She marched to the edge of the pool, her arms crossed tight. "Alex," she said, her voice carrying that sharp, accusatory tone she reserved for everything from overgrown lawns to improperly sorted recycling. "We have a problem." I kept my hands moving, keeping myself afloat. The scent of chlorine, usually a comfort, now felt like the sterile smell of a hospital room. That, and the cloying scent of her cheap perfume. "Do we, Carol?" She held up a piece of paper like a verdict. "Your pool has been deemed a liability under the new community bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph B. It's a violation." Smiley, the contractor, just stood there, chewing on what looked like nicotine gum, his head bobbing in agreement. That constant rhythmic chewing would become a detail I'd grow to hate. I pushed myself to the side of the pool, the rough concrete scraping my palms. "A liability? The hospital calls it physical therapy." "The hospital doesn't set our insurance premiums," she snapped back. She thrust the paper at me. I took it, water dripping from my fingers onto the ink. The words blurred, but a few stood out. "Immediate action required. Fines commencing $500 per day. Until filled." Filled. They wanted to bury my pool. Smiley finally spoke, his voice as slippery as his grin. "It's a safety and a ground subsidence issue, sir. We can have a crew here by Friday, quick and clean." Before I could answer, Carol stepped past me, a bright red sticker in her hand. She slapped it onto the metal of my gate. It was one of those aggressive, impossible-to-peel-off types. In stark black letters, it screamed, "Liability, a public brand." I watched her do it, feeling a cold fury begin to burn through the water's chill. I clenched my fist, and the old, jagged scar on the back of my hand turned white. It was a pale, ugly map of a bad decision I made 20 years ago, in a dark tunnel, a decision that cost my partner his mobility. It was a constant reminder of what it feels like to be trapped, to have the world literally cave in on you. They turned and left without another word. The gate clicked shut behind them. I was alone again, with just the quiet lapping of the water and that screaming red sticker. But I wasn't just looking at a pool. I was looking at the last place I heard my daughter, Emily, laugh. She'd loved this water. After we lost her, the pool became a silent monument. The thought of it being filled with dirt and gravel. It felt like a second burial. Have you ever had a place that was more than just a place? A spot on the earth that held a piece of your soul? If you have, you know exactly how I felt in that moment, and you know that surrender is not an option. I pulled myself out of the water, ignoring the familiar twinge in my back. I looked at the official notice in my hand, then at the red sticker on my gate. The homeowners association had set a meeting for Tuesday. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was just some tired old man who would roll over. She had declared war on the wrong man and the wrong pool. The community center meeting room smelled of stale coffee and quiet desperation. It was a place where petty grievances were dressed up in the language of bylaws and procedure. I sat in the back, on a cheap plastic chair that squeaked every time I moved. The notice, now dry and crinkled, was in my jacket pocket, along with letters from 3 separate orthopedic specialists. Each one stated, in clear medical terms, that daily hydrotherapy was essential for managing my chronic pain. These weren't just notes from a family doctor, they were from the best in their field. I thought they were my armor. I was wrong. Carol sat at the head table with the rest of the board, a panel of self-important gatekeepers. Smiley, the contractor, wasn't there, but his presence lingered like a bad smell. The meeting droned on, disputes over fence heights, complaints about holiday decorations left up too long. Then Carol cleared her throat. Item 7, the property at Ford's 12 Willow Creek, Mr. Henderson. All eyes turned to me. I stood up, my back protesting with a sharp jab. I walked to the front, laid the doctor's letters on the table. Carol, members of the board, I began, my voice calm and even. My pool isn't a luxury, it's a medical necessity. As these letters confirm, it's a prescribed part of my long-term physical rehabilitation. Carol picked up the top letter, glanced at it for less than a second, and then set it down. She didn't read it. She used it as a coaster for her water bottle. Thank you, Alex, she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. We appreciate your perspective. However, these are private medical opinions. They do not supersede the community's collective interest or our governing documents. A man on the board, a retired accountant named Miller, piped up. The new insurance rider is very clear. Unfenced in-ground pools of a certain age are classified as a high-risk liability. Our premiums have gone up 12% across the board because of it. So this is about money, I said flatly. It's about fiscal responsibility, Carol corrected me, a smug little smile playing on her lips. And safety. She looked out at the 24 or so residents in the room. We can't make exceptions. If we make one for Alex, where does it end? I saw a few neighbors nod in agreement, people I'd shared beers with, people whose kids I'd watched grow up. Their faces were a mixture of pity and a kind of grim relief that it was my problem, not theirs. It's amazing how fast a community can turn on one of its own when their wallets are at stake. I felt a familiar sense of isolation creep in, the same feeling I had in that dark tunnel, the knowledge that you are utterly alone. The board voted. It was unanimous. My appeal was denied. The fines, which had already reached $3,500, would continue to accrue. As I walked back to my seat, the squeak of my chair sounded like laughter. The next day, it got worse. Taped to lampposts and stuffed into mailboxes were cheap, photocopied flyers. A grainy picture of my house, my pool circled in red. The headline read, "Is your neighbor's dangerous pool threatening your family's safety?" The text below was pure poison, a mix of lies and exaggerations about child safety, mosquitoes, and the risk of foundation damage to surrounding homes. This wasn't just a bureaucratic fight anymore. It was a public execution. The war had moved to a new front, and Carol was determined to make me an outcast in my own neighborhood. She wasn't just trying to fill my pool. She was trying to bury me. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the neighborhood social media group. I'd been removed. The reason cited, spreading negativity. I crumpled the flyer in my hand, the cheap paper a soft, unsatisfying ball in my fist. The smell of ink and wet paper filled my nostrils. I had to find a way to fight back, but I was outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and publicly shamed. And that, I was beginning to realize, was exactly where Carol wanted me. Defeat tastes like burnt coffee. For 2 days, that's all I consumed, sitting at my kitchen table, staring out at the pool. The red liability sticker on the gate was the first thing I saw in the morning, and the last thing I saw at night. The fines were climbing, another $1,000 added to the bill. I felt like I was back in that mine, the walls closing in, the air getting thin. My first instinct, to fight with logic, with doctor's notes, with reason, had failed spectacularly. I decided to get out of the house. The silence was getting too loud. I drove to a little diner on the edge of town, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone Hon. I was halfway through a plate of eggs I didn't want when an old man slid into the booth opposite me. He was wiry, with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that had seen 1,000 things go wrong. It was George. He'd been the city's chief water inspector for 40 years before retiring. "Heard you're in a scrap with the homeowners association," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't wait for an answer. "Over that pool of yours." The news travels fast in a small town. "You could say that," I replied, pushing my plate away. He nodded slowly, taking a sip of his coffee. I heard their argument, ground subsidence, leaks, threatening the whole neighborhood. He let out a short, sharp laugh that was more rust than air. "That's a load of bull." I listened, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. This was the first time someone hadn't looked at me with pity. Let me tell you something about the ground here, Alex. This whole area is built on a network of clay and shale. Water doesn't just seep, it travels. It finds a path, a vein. Always has, always will. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. In our soil, he said, and this was the phrase that would change everything. Water never stands still, son. It's always looking for a vein. The trick is knowing whose vein it's going to find. I stared at him, the gears in my engineer's brain finally starting to turn again. He wasn't just making small talk. He was giving me something, a piece of the puzzle. The apathetic fog in my mind began to clear, replaced by a flicker of an idea. What if Carol's argument wasn't just a lie, but a projection? What if there was a water problem, but my pool wasn't the cause? His words stayed with me all the way home. Whose vein it's going to find. It was a clue, a breadcrumb in the dark. That evening, I didn't stare at the pool. I pulled out my old survey maps of the neighborhood, charts I'd made years ago out of professional curiosity. I spent hours poring over them, tracing the topography, the utility lines, the drainage easements. I was looking for a vein. I also found a loophole. Buried deep in the original HOA covenants, a dusty document from the 70s, was a clause about therapeutic and adaptive structures. It was vague, poorly written, but it was there. It was enough. I had a new plan. I would use their own rules against them, armed with this old clause and George's quiet hint. Hope is a dangerous thing. It can make you reckless. It can make you believe you're about to win right before the floor drops out from under you. Armed with the therapeutic structures clause, I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't felt in weeks. I requested an emergency board meeting. This time, I wasn't asking for an exception. I was demanding they follow their own founding documents. The mood in the room was even colder than before. Carol looked at me with an expression of pure annoyance, as if I were a cockroach that had survived the first spraying. "Mr. Henderson, this is highly irregular," she began. "What's irregular is the board ignoring its own covenants," I shot back, placing a highlighted copy of the old document on the table. Article 11, Section C. It allows for structures necessary for the health and well-being of a resident. My pool fits that description, and these doctors' letters prove it. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the faces of the other board members. They weren't prepared for this. They were used to steamrolling residents with the newer, more restrictive bylaws. I had them. I could feel it. The tide was turning. Then Carol smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator that has just let its prey walk right into a trap. "You're right, Alex," she said softly. "You found an old clause. Congratulations." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "But it's irrelevant." She nodded to Smiley, the contractor, who had been waiting by the door. He walked in and placed a thick, spiral-bound report on the table. It was heavy, official-looking, filled with charts and diagrams. The cover read, "Geological and Hydrological Survey of 412 Willow Creek and Surrounding Properties." It was prepared by Smiley's company. "As you know," Carol continued, her voice now filled with a triumphant venom, "your argument is based on the idea that your pool is a self-contained therapeutic device. However, this independent geological report proves otherwise." She opened the report to a page with a complex-looking 3D map of the neighborhood. A bright red arrow pointed directly at my property. "Our expert has confirmed that your pool is, in fact, leaking, significantly. It's been slowly seeping water into the ground, destabilizing the clay substrate." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. I'd built that pool myself, with reinforced concrete and a state-of-the-art liner. It was as watertight as a submarine. "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Is it?" Carol said, raising an eyebrow. She turned to my next-door neighbor, Bob, a guy I'd known for 15 years. "Bob, you've mentioned you've had some issues with your foundation lately, haven't you?" Bob, a man who usually couldn't look you in the eye, suddenly found his courage. He stood up, avoiding my gaze. "My wife. She noticed cracks in the drywall," he mumbled, looking at the floor. "In the den, on the side facing Alex's yard." It was a betrayal so swift and so complete, it took my breath away. Bob, my friend, his wife was Carol's cousin. It all clicked into place. This was a coordinated attack. The report, the timing, Bob's sudden concern. I was being framed not just by the board, but by my own neighbor. Carol closed the report with a soft, final thud. The board's decision stands. The pool is a liability. Now, it's not just a liability to our finances, but a proven physical threat to the entire community. She looked directly at me, her eyes glinting with victory. The fines continue, Alex, and we are now petitioning the county for an injunction to have the nuisance abated, forcibly. That was it. Checkmate. I had walked in thinking I held the winning card, only to find out she owned the whole deck. As I walked out of that room, the whispers of my neighbors felt like stones hitting my back. My reputation was ruined. My only ally had betrayed me. And now, they weren't just fining me. They were coming to destroy the last piece of my daughter's memory with the full force of the law. I got into my car, the sterile report still on the passenger seat, a monument to their perfect lie. And that's when my phone rang. It was my insurance agent. My homeowner's policy was being reevaluated due to newly disclosed geological risks. My premium was about to skyrocket. The world has a way of going silent when you truly hit bottom. The angry phone calls from the homeowners association, the concerned texts from my few remaining friends, the endless hum of the refrigerator, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. For a day, I just sat there. The fraudulent geological report lay on my table, a testament to how thoroughly I'd been beaten. They had an expert, a concerned neighbor, and the full weight of the board on their side. I had a truth nobody wanted to hear. It was in that silence that George's words came back to me. Water is always looking for a vein. The trick is knowing whose vein it's going to find. They had created a lie about a leak, a fictional leak from my pool. My mind, trained for decades to trace the flow of water, to see the unseen paths it carves through the earth, started to work on a different problem. Not how to disprove their lie, but how to use it. If they insisted there was a leak, a hidden river of my water flowing under the neighborhood, then who was I to argue? I just needed to prove where that river was really coming from. The idea was insane. It was desperate. It was perfect. It was a plan that required a performance, a public spectacle. And it was a plan that was born from the very core of my professional expertise, the reconstruction of events. I wasn't a lawyer or a politician. I was an engineer who understood flow. This wouldn't be one with paper. It would be one with physics. I made a call, not to a lawyer, but to George's son, Leo. He was a 17-year-old kid who was more comfortable with a drone controller in his hands than a baseball bat. He was a tech whiz, bored out of his mind in our quiet suburb, and hungry for a real-world mission. Leo, I said, I need a pilot, and I need an eye in the sky. Can you get your drone to hover over the storm drain at the corner of Oak and Miller and live stream the feed? He didn't ask why. He just said, when? Next, I went to a specialty chemical supply store. I walked out with a container of industrial-grade, non-toxic, biodegradable fluorescent dye, the kind used for leak detection in large-scale plumbing. Under normal light, it was a dull, murky green, but in water, it would transform, creating a vibrant, impossible-to-ignore trail of electric green. It was the color of revelation. It was the color of truth. The night before the annual community summer fair, the stage was set. It was the biggest neighborhood event of the year, a gathering where Carol and the board always gave a self-congratulatory speech. This year, I knew, their big topic would be the successful containment of the threat I posed. They were going to use me as a trophy. As I stood by my pool in the dark, the container of dye in my hand, I felt a strange calm. This was more than a rebuttal. It was a counter-ambush. I looked at the dark, still water, my daughter's memorial. Tomorrow, I was going to turn it into a weapon they had handed me themselves. The summer fair was in full swing. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and grilled hot dogs. Kids were running everywhere, and families were spread out on blankets in the park. On a small, temporary stage, Carol was at the microphone, basking in the warm afternoon sun. Smiley, the contractor, stood beside her, his arms crossed, that same smug grin plastered on his face. They were the king and queen of this little kingdom. And thanks to the board's decisive action, Carol was saying, her voice amplified across the park, we have addressed a significant safety and environmental concern, ensuring the stability and value of all our homes. She was talking about me, about my pool. I saw some of my neighbors nod, looking self-satisfied. I waited until she finished, until the smattering of polite applause died down. Then I walked towards the stage. I wasn't angry. I was cold. I was focused. I had a tablet in my hand. A few people noticed me, a murmur spreading through the crowd. Carol's face tightened when she saw me approaching. "Alex, this is a private community event," she said into the microphone, a clear warning in her voice. "I know," I said, my voice steady as I climbed the 2 steps onto the stage. "And I'm here as a member of this community. You've been talking a lot about my pool, about a leak." I turned to the crowd. "You all deserve to see the truth." Before Carol could have me removed, I connected my tablet to the large projector screen they were using for a slideshow. The screen flickered, and then an image appeared, a live aerial view of a storm drain grate, leaves and twigs collected around its edges. It was the feed from Leo's drone. "This is the main storm drain for our section of the neighborhood," I explained, 2 blocks from my house. I held up a bucket filled with water from my pool. "Carol's expert says my pool is leaking, so let's test that theory." In front of everyone, I poured a small vial of the fluorescent dye into the bucket. The water swirled with a faint green tint. Then I tipped the bucket over, pouring the water back into my own pool, just off to the side of the stage. The crowd watched, confused. On the big screen, the water in the storm drain remained unchanged. Nothing. "As you can see," I said, "my pool is sealed. It's not the source." The air was tense. Carol looked furious, ready to cut my microphone. "Now," I said, turning my attention to a newly laid patch of lush green sod right next to the park. It was part of a community beautification project that Smiley's company had just completed, right near Carol's own house. "Let's see what happens when we test the new eco-friendly drainage system installed by Smiley here." I walked over to the new lawn, carrying a second, larger bucket of plain water. I upended it, soaking the perfect grass. The crowd was silent, their eyes glued to the projector screen. For a moment, nothing happened. 10 seconds. 20. I could hear Carol whispering urgently to a security guard. Then it happened. A trickle of electric green appeared on the screen, seeping from the side of the storm drain. It wasn't a leak. It was a torrent. A river of vibrant, toxic-looking green flooded the drain, a visual confession pouring into the public waterway. A collective gasp went through the crowd. I turned back to the microphone, my voice ringing out in the stunned silence. "That green color? That's the dye residue from the fertilizer Smiley's crew used on this very lawn. He saved money by skipping the impermeable membrane and proper drainage pipes. He created a system that dumps chemical runoff directly into the groundwater." I pointed at the bound report still clutched in Carol's hand. That geological report wasn't a diagnosis of my property. It was a preemptive cover-up of his own shoddy, illegal work. He knew this would eventually contaminate the groundwater, so he found a scapegoat. I looked directly at Carol. He found me. Just then, an old, familiar figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was George, the retired inspector. He took the microphone I offered him. "What he's saying is true," George said, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years of service. "This isn't just a violation of homeowners association rules. This is a violation of state environmental law." The crowd wasn't whispering anymore. They were staring at Carol and Smiley, their faces a mask of fury. The tide hadn't just turned. It was a tsunami. Panic is a funny thing. On Carol, it looked like her face was melting. The smug certainty she wore like a second skin dissolved into a puddle of disbelief and terror. Smiley's grin was gone, replaced by the pale, slack-jawed look of a man watching his entire life circle the drain. The crowd was a low, angry hum. They weren't looking at me as the neighborhood pariah anymore. I was the one who had pulled back the curtain. The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights and official-looking people. County code enforcement, the Environmental Protection Department. George had apparently made a few calls before the fair. They swarmed the park, taking samples, roping off the beautification project with yellow tape. It was no longer a he said, she said dispute. It was a crime scene. A few days later, I got a call. It was from a lawyer representing the homeowners association. They offered me a deal. They would drop all the fines, pay for any legal or personal expenses I'd incurred, and publicly exonerate me. In return, all I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement. I was to forget the whole thing ever happened. It was the ultimate test, wasn't it? take the money, get my life back, and let the system quietly sweep its mess under the rug. Have you ever been offered an easy way out of a hard fight? It's tempting. For a second, I thought about the peace, the quiet. But then I thought about Emily. I thought about the principle. I thought about that red sticker on my gate. Some things you can't put a price on. No deal, I said, and hung up. My victory wasn't going to be a quiet backroom settlement. I didn't file a lawsuit for money. Instead, I used the leverage I had, the threat of a massive civil suit that would bankrupt the association and expose every dirty deal, to force a change. With George's help, we drafted a new amendment to the community bylaws. We called it Emily's Amendment. It established clear, fair, and transparent rules for the installation and maintenance of therapeutic and adaptive equipment for any resident with a documented medical need. It stripped the board of its power to arbitrarily declare things a liability without independent third-party verification. The board, facing a full-blown resident revolt and a mountain of legal trouble, had no choice but to adopt it. Carol and the other board members involved resigned in disgrace. Smiley's company went bankrupt, and he faced state charges. Bob, my neighbor, came to my door one evening, his head hung low, and tried to apologize. I just closed the door. Some betrayals can't be unspoken. My relationship with many of my neighbors is still strained. A quiet casualty of the war I had to fight. That's the price of victory, I suppose. It's never free. Now, when I float in my pool, the water feels different. It's not just a place of peace anymore, it's a place of victory. On the wall in my study, framed, is a copy of the new bylaw with Emily's amendment highlighted. Next to it, in a smaller frame, is that ugly red liability sticker I peeled off my gate. And every now and then, I look at the scar on my hand. It used to be a symbol of my greatest failure, but now, when the light hits it just right, it looks a little bit like a river that found its way home. If a story like this has ever hit close to home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It lets me know I'm not the only one out here fighting the good fight.